I had my hands deep in warm, soapy water, rinsing the casserole dish from last night's dinner, and the hum of the dishwasher behind me had almost lulled me into a kind of rhythm, the kind that only settles in when the house is quiet and the sun's already pushing through the kitchen blinds in thick, lazy stripes. It was the kind of summer morning where time moves slowly, where the air feels heavier than it should, not because of heat but because of everything unsaid, and I didn't expect to feel a hand on my back. Not there. Not like that. Not then. It wasn't a pat or a push or even a bump from passing too close in a narrow space. It was a full palm, steady and deliberate, low between my shoulder blades, a touch that made my chest tighten and my breath catch even as I kept scrubbing. Turned my head, not fast, not slow, just enough to see who it was, though I already knew. Tom. He didn't flinch or stammer or explain. He didn't even look startled that I'd noticed. He just kept walking toward the patio door with the same calm, unhurried steps, like brushing. His hand across my back had been as natural as flipping on a light switch or adjusting a chair. I stared at the spot where he'd touched me long after he was gone, not because it hurt, but because it lingered, sharper than it should have. Tom was 20, our daughter's friend from her environmental science program. She'd left for her fieldwork internship 3 days ago, driving upstate with a packed car and a checklist so long I could barely read it without laughing. Tom arrived a week before she left, planning to stay just a few days, but then something changed and my husband offered the guest room without blinking. He's a good kid, he said. Doesn't eat much. Let him stay while she's away. It's just the summer. I nodded, like it made sense. It almost did. That evening we ate outside, the three of us. My husband grilled, as usual, and Tom sat down closer to me than he had before. Not right next to me, but close enough that the space between our chairs felt smaller than it should have been. He didn't talk much, just a few short sentences about the heat or the burgers or the dog barking next door. But when he did speak, he spoke softly, directly, like everything else at the table faded when he looked at me. And he did look. Not quickly, not accidentally. His eyes didn't flick away when my husband sat down or when the conversation drifted into neutral territory. He watched me like I was the one he came here for. Later that night, I tried to brush it off. I folded laundry. In our bedroom, while my husband dozed off in the recliner downstairs, football replay murmuring in the background. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was being dramatic, that maybe Tom was just awkward, or maybe he thought I reminded him of someone he used to know. But the next morning, he was in the kitchen before me, already pouring cereal like he lived here, like he'd always lived here. He smiled when I walked in, but not the kind of smile you give someone's mother or someone's wife. It was a smile that didn't ask permission. By lunchtime, I'd noticed the pattern. He kept showing up wherever I was. If I went to the back porch to check the plants, he wandered out a minute later and stood silently near the railing like he was thinking. If I started the laundry, he came down the stairs saying he needed something from the storage room. Once, I opened the garage to find a missing screwdriver, and there he was, claiming he needed a wrench for his bike chain, though I hadn't seen the bike moved once since he got here. It wasn't until I went into the living room late that afternoon that it stopped being subtle. The TV was already on, a show I hadn't seen in months, not something my husband ever watched, and certainly not the kind of thing Tom's generation usually cared about. It was a procedural crime drama I used to binge secretly on quiet nights, when the house was asleep, when I could stretch across the couch and drink wine and pretend the world was softer than it really was. It was paused at the exact episode where I'd left off, one I never talked about, never even mentioned aloud. He sat on the floor, cross-legged, not looking at the screen, but waiting for me to notice it. When he heard me step in, he glanced back and said, "This one's good, right?" As if he knew it was mine, as if he had watched me watch it. I didn't answer. I just picked up the laundry basket and went back upstairs. But I felt it again. That same heaviness I felt at the sink that morning, like something had shifted under the floor and no one else heard the sound. The house had never felt smaller than it did that week, and it wasn't because of anything physical. Not the walls, not the furniture, not the way sound carried when doors weren't fully closed. It was the way Tom started moving through it like he belonged to its quiet corners, the way he always seemed to find me, never looking surprised when our eyes met even when I hadn't made a sound, even when I'd changed rooms 3 times just to be alone for 15 minutes without company or conversation, or the weight of someone's gaze pressing into my back like an imprint I couldn't scrub off. My husband didn't notice it. Not the pattern, not the timing, not the strange closeness that had started to fill up the space between polite and something else. When I mentioned that Tom had been home more than usual, that he always seemed to show up wherever I went, that he'd stopped going out to see his friends altogether, my husband barely looked up from his laptop and said the same thing he'd said before with a shrug and a grin like it was all harmless. "He's 20. Let him do his thing. He's not a kid. He can take care of himself." But that wasn't what I meant. I didn't care if he went out or stayed in. I cared that I'd stopped feeling like a person in my own home and started feeling like a screen someone was watching behind the safety of silence. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more obvious it became. One morning, I was rinsing a glass at the kitchen sink and heard the bathroom door open down the hall. I didn't think anything of it until I glanced up and caught his reflection in the microwave door across from me. He was walking past, damp from the shower, towel low on his hips, one hand running through his wet hair, the other holding a toothbrush loosely at his side. I turned away quickly, focusing on the water running over my hand, but I saw enough in that half second, how he didn't rush to cover himself, how the towel slipped a little as he moved, how he walked slowly like he knew he was being seen and didn't mind. He didn't speak, didn't say good morning, didn't even nod. He just passed by like it was all perfectly normal. That evening, the house was especially quiet. My husband had driven out to his brother's to help him with something in the garage, and I stayed back because I said I had laundry to finish, though in truth I just needed a few hours without anyone asking me for anything or watching me with eyes that didn't blink. I folded clothes in our bedroom, slowly, more for the motion than the task, and I left the door half open because it always creaked if you closed it completely, and I'd learned over the years that quiet creaks were worse than soft, open spaces. First, I thought I was imagining it again. The shape in the doorway, the figure leaning just slightly against the frame like he'd been there a while. I looked up and there he was. Tom, not speaking, not moving, just watching. No expression on his face, no reason to be there. He didn't knock, didn't smile, didn't even pretend he needed something. He stood there for a full 5 seconds, maybe more, until the weight of his presence filled the room like heat that seeps into your skin before you realize you're sweating. Then, as quietly as he appeared, he left. I didn't close the door. I stared at the hallway long after he'd gone, my hands still resting on the warm towel I hadn't folded yet, heart beating too fast for something that hadn't even happened, breath shallow for something no one would ever understand if I tried to explain it. There were no words for it, no accusations I could make, because nothing had happened. Not really. But I felt it like you feel a storm before it arrives, in the pressure behind your eyes and the strange stillness in the trees, and the way your own voice suddenly sounds unfamiliar in your throat when you try to tell yourself you're fine. He never touched me again that day. Never said anything strange or crossed any lines you could point to, but he didn't need to, because the air had shifted. The rhythm of the house was off. The distance between rooms had narrowed. And every time I stepped through a doorway, I braced myself for the feeling that someone else's presence had already gotten there first. The next morning began too quietly, not because anything was wrong yet, not because anything had happened that someone could point to or question, but because I woke up with the kind of awareness you don't normally feel unless you've already crossed some invisible line in your own mind, the kind that makes you listen more closely to footsteps downstairs or the subtle click of a cupboard closing, and as I wrapped my robe tighter and tied my hair up the way I always did before coming down, I heard the coffee machine already running and the sound of a second mug being placed on the counter. And when I walked into the kitchen, I found Tom standing there, already dressed, holding out a cup with one hand like this had always been part of our morning routine. I didn't ask why he was up that early, or how he knew I'd be there, or how he'd managed to guess exactly how I take my coffee without ever seeing me prepare it myself. I just took the mug and gave the kind of nod you give when it's too early to say no but too late to pretend it means nothing, and I told myself it was just a gesture, that it was normal, that I shouldn't read into it. But when he leaned against the counter across from me and didn't take a sip of his own drink, I realized he wasn't there for the coffee at all. He was watching how I drank mine. He didn't leave after breakfast the way he sometimes did, didn't mention errands or friends or the gym or anything else he used to say to fill space. He stayed close, but not in an obvious way, helping clean the kitchen and lingering longer than necessary when I moved to the pantry to reorganize a few things that had gotten misplaced during the week. And just as I stood on my toes trying to reach the jar of lentils on the top shelf, I felt him behind me, not touching, but too close for it to be coincidence. And when I turned, he reached over my head with one arm and grabbed the jar without asking, handing it to me like we did this every day. Like this proximity wasn't unusual. It was at that exact moment that my husband walked into the kitchen, still half distracted by something on his phone, and for a second he stopped, not speaking, just standing there, watching the space between me and Tom, and even though nothing was being said, the silence itself was louder than anything else in the room. So I took a step to the side, enough to widen the gap, enough to make it look like there had never been one. And my husband looked at me for a second longer than usual before walking past us to grab a bottle of water from the fridge, saying nothing, acting like nothing had happened, even though I knew he'd noticed something and chose not to name it. Later that afternoon, I was slicing lemons at the counter while Tom was rinsing something in the sink, and as I turned to grab a napkin from the holder beside him, he reached for one at the same moment and our fingers touched. Just for a second, just enough to make my hand flinch back, and I caught my breath without meaning to. But he didn't move, didn't apologize, didn't glance up or act like it mattered. He just handed me the napkin and turned back to what he was doing, like touching me had been part of some silent agreement neither of us remembered making. It was always like that with him. Silent moments stretched just long enough to mean something but short enough to deny. And I started avoiding places he might follow. But it didn't matter. Because even when I wasn't looking for him, he appeared. Always when my husband wasn't nearby. Always when there was just enough time to make me aware of my own breathing and posture and the weight of the air between us. Later that day, I was in the pantry again, organizing the toolbox we kept in a plastic bin near the floor, crouched down and trying to untangle cords from screwdrivers, when I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Tom standing there with a spool of wire in his hand like he'd just come to help. And I nodded without thinking, too tired to pretend it meant anything, and we worked silently for a few minutes until I stood up to leave and he followed behind me, not saying anything, just walking in step until we reached the hallway. And as I stepped out into the light, my husband came around the corner carrying an empty mug, stopping mid-step as he saw the two of us standing too close. Not touching, but not separate enough to ignore. He looked between us and asked, "Were you looking for something?" And before I could think too hard, I answered, "Just putting the tools back," because it was true and yet not enough. And he held my gaze for a second too long before walking away again like it hadn't happened. But the air didn't clear after he left. It stayed heavy and dense and full of everything that wasn't said. Just before dinner, as I was heading toward the stairs with a basket of folded towels, I passed Tom in the hallway, and we brushed shoulders, slightly. Not enough to be called a touch, but enough to feel like a decision. And as I turned to look at him, he didn't stop or smile or speak, just kept walking like we hadn't collided at all. And I stood there a second longer than I should have, holding the basket and staring at the spot where his arm had passed mine like a current had run through it. When I finally sat down to catch my breath in the living room, he entered a few minutes later and didn't sit, just stood near the archway and asked, "Do you want me to leave the house?" And I didn't answer immediately because I didn't understand the question, didn't know if he meant now or later or forever, so I said, "It's not my house." And he nodded slowly and said, "Then you won't say no if I stay," and left the room without waiting for a reply. I stayed there on the edge of the couch, holding my breath without realizing it, my hands resting on my knees too tightly, the tension in my shoulders pulling upward like I was bracing for something I couldn't quite name. And even after Tom left the room, the echo of his words stayed in the air like dust that won't settle. The kind of sentence that keeps unraveling long after it's spoken, because he hadn't asked for permission and he hadn't demanded forgiveness. He had simply stated something that left me no clear place to stand, no way to say yes or no without also admitting I'd been watching this happen and hadn't stopped it. I didn't know what time it was when I finally stood up and carried the empty laundry basket back upstairs. Didn't know how long I had sat frozen in that same spot trying to decide whether I should pretend nothing was happening or if pretending was already a choice I'd made too many times this week. And when I walked past the guest room door, I didn't even glance in. I just kept going, pretending again that if I moved fast enough, maybe the silence between rooms would feel less deliberate, less full. That night, after the dinner dishes were stacked and rinsed and the kitchen lights dimmed the way my husband always liked them before we watched our separate shows in separate rooms, I stayed in the hallway longer than I needed to, not because I wanted to see him again, but because I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't waiting for anything at all. And yet when I saw Tom's figure walking down the corridor toward me, slowly, like he was taking in every line of the walls and the floorboards and the light from the stairwell, I didn't step away. He didn't rush, didn't pretend he had somewhere else to be, didn't carry anything or use his phone as a distraction. He just walked, steady and silent, looking directly ahead, not avoiding my eyes but not seeking them either. And the slow certainty of his movement made it feel like this wasn't an accident, like he wasn't passing through the house. He was passing through me. He didn't speak, and I didn't ask him to. I just stood there with my back against the wall, the laundry basket still in my hands even though I'd already folded everything. The air between us too still to call ordinary, too quiet to name. And when he passed, the fabric of his sleeve brushed the edge of mine, and I didn't move. I didn't know how to describe what was happening, not to myself and certainly not to anyone else because there was no evidence, no obvious line being crossed, no word or action that could be held up and examined or rejected. But there was something building in the spaces between us, a slow accumulation of looks and steps and brushes of hands that I hadn't invited but hadn't blocked either. And the more I told myself it was nothing, the more it became something I couldn't ignore. The next morning was colder than it had been in weeks, the kind of dry chill that seeps through windows even when they're closed. And I found myself moving slower, dressing with more layers, wrapping my robe tighter, even though the house wasn't truly cold. And when I came downstairs, I wasn't surprised to find the coffee already made, and Tom already there, sitting at the table like he had every right to be the first to fill the room. He didn't say anything when I entered. He just slid a mug toward the edge of the table without looking up, like the rhythm of our mornings had already been established, and nothing needed explanation. And I took it, not because I wanted to, but because refusing it would have made something louder that we were both pretending wasn't there. As I sipped in silence, my husband came in behind me, kissed the top of my head in his usual distracted way, then reached for the cereal without commenting on the extra mug on the table or the way Tom was already halfway through his own breakfast, and I watched them both for a moment, wondering how many things could go unnoticed in plain sight, how many moments could happen and still be swallowed by the quiet routines we tell ourselves are normal. Tom didn't speak again until my husband had left the room, and even then it wasn't loud or obvious. It was a whisper of a question, low and quiet and measured, like he already knew the answer, like he didn't need to hear it to believe it. "You don't like how this feels," he said, not asking, not accusing, just stating it in a way that made my throat tighten, and I didn't answer because I didn't know how. Didn't know what part of the sentence I was supposed to disagree with, didn't know if disagreeing would have even made a difference. He looked at me just long enough to make me look away, then stood and left his half-full mug on the table like it didn't matter, walking out of the kitchen without waiting for me to speak, without looking back, without changing pace. And as I stood there with both hands wrapped too tightly around a coffee cup I didn't want, I realized that silence wasn't something he was afraid of. It was the space where he waited. The house was quiet again that morning, the kind of slow, stretched silence that settles in when the hours feel heavier than usual, and the walls seem to lean closer than they should. And I sat by the back window with my book open but unread, holding it between my hands like a shield, even though the words blurred into each other, and I had reread the same page 3 times without absorbing a single sentence. And just when I thought maybe I'd finally have a morning without tension, without any strange glances or comments left dangling in the air, I heard his footsteps approaching behind me, steady and unhurried as always. And then he sat down beside me, not on the other end of the sofa like he had before, not with polite space or the pretense of casualness, but close enough that I could feel the heat from his leg brushing the side of mine even though he didn't touch me fully, and he said nothing at all. There was no joke this time, no idle question about breakfast or errands or the weather, just silence from him that stretched out longer than it should have. And I didn't look up because I didn't want to be the one to break it first, didn't want to admit that the air between us had thickened into something impossible to ignore. And when I finally did turn my head to meet his eyes, he didn't blink or shift away. He just watched me with that same unnerving stillness he always carried, the kind that made it feel like he'd been rehearsing every second of this moment in his head, long before I even woke up. Then he said it, not loudly but clearly, in that same even voice he used when he was pretending not to say anything important, and yet every word felt deliberate and heavy and placed exactly where he wanted it to land. "You haven't said stop in a long time." It wasn't a question, and it wasn't a joke. It was a line drawn so precisely I didn't know whether I was supposed to cross it or back away, and I stared at him for a second too long before answering, knowing full well that whatever I said next would sit in the space between us like a match waiting to be lit. "And you haven't asked in a long time." My voice didn't waver and my hands didn't tremble, but something in my chest twisted anyway, because I knew before I even said it that there was no pulling it back, and as soon as the words left my mouth, he leaned forward slowly, without hesitation, without testing the distance like he had before, and when his hand rested lightly on the cushion beside me, he didn't close the gap with urgency or force. He just moved like he'd already been granted permission and was only collecting what he was owed. His lips touched mine like he'd been waiting for hours, days, maybe even longer, and the kiss was soft at first, almost careful, like he wanted to make sure I wouldn't flinch or freeze or ruin the illusion. And when I didn't pull away, when I didn't turn my face or stiffen in protest, he deepened it just slightly, his fingers brushing the side of my wrist as if to anchor himself in the moment, and I felt my eyes close without meaning to. Not because I wanted to give in, but because I already had. Then something shifted, not in him, but in me. And I leaned forward and kissed him again, this time without waiting, without hesitation, not out of confusion or weakness, but with the kind of motion that doesn't belong to logic or planning, but to something deeper and far less explainable. And I hated how natural it felt, how easy it was to close the space between us when I had spent so long pretending it didn't exist at all. As soon as I pulled back, I stood up without looking at him, without reaching for anything or offering explanation, and I walked straight to the bathroom and turned on the faucet with hands that felt too warm, too visible, too much like they belonged to someone else. And I splashed cold water on my face 3 times before daring to lift my eyes to the mirror. And when I did, I didn't recognize the look staring back at me, not because it was guilt or fear or excitement, but because it was all of them at once. I stood there until the water had stopped dripping from my chin, until my breathing had slowed enough to pass for normal. And then I dried my face on the nearest towel, ran my hands through my hair, and stepped back into the hallway like nothing had happened, like I had never left the kitchen table with my heart pounding and someone else's breath still on my skin. By the time I came back downstairs, the house had shifted again, the air lighter, the silence more familiar, and when my husband returned from his errands not long after, carrying a small bag of groceries and shaking the rain from his jacket, he glanced at me with his usual warmth and asked if everything was all right, and I smiled and said, "Nothing special," with a calmness I didn't feel, because it wasn't a lie, not exactly. Not when nothing had changed that could be proven, or named or written down. He nodded and put the groceries away, humming to himself as he moved between cabinets like the world hadn't tilted slightly while he was gone, and I stood by the sink watching him for a few long seconds, wondering if he would sense something out of place. But he didn't, because he never looked closely enough to notice. The kitchen felt too small that evening, not in the way it usually did when we cooked together or bumped elbows near the spice rack, but in the way silence becomes louder when no one dares to fill it, and I moved through it mechanically, stirring, sauce, checking the oven timer, wiping the counter even when it didn't need cleaning, while Tom stood only a few steps away, not helping, not pretending to be busy, just existing in the same air with the same quiet intention that had been following me since morning. And when I reached for the drawer with the napkins, his hand brushed against mine, slow and unflinching. And even though I should have pulled away, should have stepped back, should have said something that closed the space between what happened and what shouldn't happen again, I didn't. He leaned closer, just enough to make his voice feel like a breath along the edge of my jaw, and he whispered, "You didn't forget." Not as a question, but as a reminder, a statement, a line I had already crossed and couldn't erase, and I didn't answer, not right away. Not because I didn't have words, but because I didn't know which ones would leave the smallest mark. Finally, I said, "It was one time." Not even looking at him, just staring at the towel in my hand, like it might give me a script to follow or a place to hide, but he didn't let it end there, didn't pull away, didn't allow the moment to dissolve quietly into a mistake we could both ignore. He said, "You want it to be too." The words landed heavier than they should have, not because he was wrong, not because he was trying to provoke me, but because he said them with certainty, without hesitation, without apology, like he had already counted my silence as permission. And I hated how much truth sat behind the sentence, how easily it fit into the hollow between want and fear, and the weight of consequences I couldn't bring myself to name out loud. I didn't respond. Not with words, not with expression, not even with a breath that gave anything away. I just turned and walked toward the back door as if I were going to check on the patio cushions or step out for air, and the moment I touched the handle, I knew I wouldn't be alone for long, not because I heard his steps behind me, but because I felt the pull of his attention like a thread stretching across the space between us. The terrace was quiet, the sun already sinking into the horizon, casting long shadows across the railing and leaving the wooden boards beneath my feet cooler than I expected. And I stood there with both hands resting lightly on the edge of the railing, staring out into the yard like I was watching for something, though I didn't know what. And I stayed still even when I heard the door open behind me, even when I felt him approach and stop just close enough that I could sense him without looking. We didn't speak, didn't move, didn't reach for each other or pretend we weren't standing exactly where we wanted to be. We just stayed like that, still and silent, staring into the darkening yard while the night pulled itself around us slowly and completely. He didn't touch me, not this time. And I didn't look over to see if he was watching my hands or my face or the way my shoulders rose and fell as I tried to breathe evenly through the weight of everything we weren't saying. But I knew he hadn't come out there by accident, just like I knew I hadn't stepped outside to be alone. We stood side by side for what felt like hours but couldn't have been more than a few minutes. The space between us tighter than air, thinner than tension, full of the kind of closeness that doesn't need permission because it already knows it's been allowed. And neither of us moved to go back inside, not because we were waiting for something to happen, but because we both knew that going back meant pretending again, and the longer we stayed, the harder it would be to pretend we weren't already changed. The house behind us stayed quiet. No sounds from the television or the creak of stairs or the voice of my husband calling from the hallway, and for the first time in weeks I felt suspended in a moment that didn't belong to any version of my life I had planned, and yet felt too real to ignore. When I finally turned my head, he didn't move, didn't shift away, didn't soften the gaze I knew I'd find waiting, and I didn't smile or frown or blink. I just stood there holding that moment in my chest, like a secret I couldn't release. Eventually, I stepped back from the railing, not to leave, but to break the stillness, and he stepped back too, matching me without question, without a word. and we stood in the center of the terrace beneath the soft porch light that flickered once and then steadied, casting both of us in the same narrow glow like it was some kind of confession neither of us had the nerve to speak. We didn't go back inside together. We just lingered, side by side, in a silence that didn't ask for answers but still demanded something be felt. Tom touched my waist inappropriately on the stairs, and I realized he had deliberately disabled the security camera, showing premeditation, in creating opportunities for inappropriate contact without being recorded. I didn't say anything as I stepped away from him and continued toward the linen closet. Didn't turn back or ask questions I wasn't ready to hear answers to, but something had shifted again, not just in the way he looked at me, but in the way he stopped pretending there was a line between privacy and audacity. And by the time dinner came around, that shift had moved into every room of the house. We were clearing plates when my husband mentioned we were low on a few groceries and asked if I could run out later. And before I could answer, Tom walked past him toward the sink and said, "We're going together, I already told her," as casually as if it were a standing arrangement. And the way his voice dropped the word "we" into the space between them made me stop breathing for half a second because I had never said a word to anyone about errands, let alone shared plans with him in front of my husband. And when I looked toward my husband expecting a pause, a question, a flicker of confusion, he simply nodded and said, "That works," then went back to drying his hands with no sign that he noticed how still I had gone. Later that night, I stood in the hallway with a stack of clean dish towels in my hands, listening to my husband rummage through the drawer in the study looking for old utility bills. And when I turned the corner toward the den to put the towels away, Tom passed, me so closely I could smell the faint citrus of the soap he used. And without warning, without checking who might be watching, he leaned in and kissed my cheek. Quick, confident, unmistakable. And then kept walking like it had been nothing, like my husband wasn't just one room away. And I stood frozen with one hand still clutching the fabric and said, "You're insane." Not loud, not even sharply, but enough for him to hear. He didn't stop or apologize or flinch. He just said, "You didn't pull away," over his shoulder, not accusing, not smug, just stating it like it was a fact we had both now acknowledged. When my husband returned to the kitchen later, he leaned against the counter and asked if something was wrong with me lately, if I'd noticed how tense I'd been when the three of us were together. And before I could figure out what to say, before I could deflect or lie or redirect, I answered too honestly and said, "Because he's not a child." And that hung in the air for just a second too long before my husband laughed and said, "He's just a friend of our daughter's, for God's sake," and walked away shaking his head like I had overreacted, like I was being dramatic, like none of this could be what it was slowly becoming. By the time we sat down for dinner, the tension had shifted from something private to something visible, at least to me. And while my husband scrolled through the news on his phone and commented on the rising gas prices, Tom sat across the table and stared at me, not blinking, not pretending to glance, just watching me with a patience that made my skin crawl. And I kept my eyes on my plate, careful not to meet his gaze, careful to stay inside the boundaries I kept redrawing with every new look he gave me, while my husband noticed nothing and said nothing and let the conversation wander off into weekend plans. That night, I left the door to the bedroom slightly open the way I always used to before any of this started, not because I wanted to see him again or invite anything new into that space, but because the habit had become too familiar to break without admitting I had been doing it on purpose. And though he didn't step inside, though he didn't knock or whisper or reach for the knob, I heard his footsteps in the hallway around. 2 in the morning, soft and unhurried, pausing near the door just long enough to let me know he was there. I didn't get up. I didn't close it. I just lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to silence pulse through the walls like something alive. The next morning, when I walked into the kitchen, he reached for a glass at the same time I did, and his fingers brushed the inside of my wrist, not quickly, not apologetically, and I pulled my hand away with more force than I meant to, saying sharply, "Enough," louder than I expected, and he tilted his head slightly and said, "Then say it like you mean it." And when I didn't answer, when I couldn't form a sentence that sounded like finality, he didn't smile or speak again, he just poured his water and walked away. By evening, the quiet had turned into something thicker, and we found ourselves alone in the kitchen again, both standing near the sink, not saying a word, not touching, not moving, just holding still in the awareness that we had reached a place where silence no longer protected us from being discovered, and whatever came next, we both knew there was no going back to pretending. The silence in the kitchen that night didn't feel like absence, it felt like pressure, like the pause between lightning and thunder when your skin tenses without permission, and you count the why. Seconds to guess how close it really is, and I stood by the refrigerator pretending to organize the shelves for no real reason, moving bottles around with distracted fingers, while behind me Tom leaned against the counter near the sink with his arms crossed, saying nothing, making no effort to break the tension, just watching, just waiting. And the longer I stayed in the room, the more I realized I wasn't cleaning or arranging or doing anything productive. I was stalling because neither of us had said a word, and still somehow everything had already been said. I opened the freezer and stared inside as though I'd forgotten what I came for, then shut it again without removing anything. And as I turned, I saw him still watching, still silent, and I couldn't stop my eyes from meeting his, couldn't stop my breath from hitching, when the quiet between us swelled into something more than avoidance, something denser than guilt, something real and present and breathing just under the surface of everything we were trying not to acknowledge. And I hated how used to this I was becoming, how natural it felt to exist inside this silent understanding. He didn't speak until I reached for the dishcloth on the counter, and even then it wasn't loud or dramatic. It was low and deliberate, his voice slipping into the space like a thread pulling the moment tighter. "You know we can't keep doing this," he said, not as a warning or complaint, but as something inevitable, like an announcement made only after the outcome was already sealed. And I didn't answer because I didn't know whether he meant the stares or the silence, or the way my hand didn't flinch anymore when his brushed mine in passing. And I hated the part of me that waited for him to keep talking, just to feel that familiar tension stretch again. I moved past him toward the sink, needing distance I wouldn't maintain, and he didn't reach for me this time, didn't try to touch me or block my path, but I could feel his presence behind me like a second shadow, and when I stood there with my hands under cold water pretending to rinse a glass I'd already cleaned, he came closer, close enough that I felt the warmth of him at my back but not close enough to call it a touch, and I closed my eyes for half a breath and let the water run too long because I didn't trust my face to stay neutral if I turned around. By the time I dried my hands and stepped back, he had already moved to the other side of the room, giving me the space he knew I wouldn't ask for, and we stood like that for another minute. Him leaning on the edge of the counter, me pretending to straighten the napkins, both of us pretending the quiet hadn't changed shape completely, and I thought if I stayed long enough, the sound of my husband walking down the hallway might rescue me from the moment. But the hallway stayed empty, and the silence stayed whole. That night, I got into bed with a kind of weariness that didn't come from the body but from carrying too many unsaid things inside your chest. And my husband lay beside me reading news, on his phone with his shoulder brushing mine like nothing about our life had shifted, and I closed my eyes without speaking and tried to will myself into sleep before the thoughts could arrive and rearrange themselves into something unbearable. And when the sound of soft footsteps returned in the hallway just past midnight, I kept my eyes closed and my breath slow and didn't turn toward the door, but I heard them stop again, right there outside the bedroom. He didn't knock, he didn't whisper, he didn't try to come in, he didn't have to. I lay awake for another hour after the steps faded, my body still, my mind loud, my guilt turning in place like a door half opened and never closed. The next morning, I moved through the house like nothing had changed, making coffee while the sun crept through the blinds, setting the table the same way I always did. And when Tom entered the kitchen behind me, he didn't hesitate or wait for an excuse to make contact. He reached past me for the sugar and let his hand brush my elbow with the same casual certainty he always used now. Like the space between us didn't need permission anymore. I turned and looked at him straight for the first time in days and said, "Stop that," with enough force to sound firm but not enough to sound angry, and he leaned just slightly closer, just enough to let the pause settle again, and said, "Then say it like you mean it." And when I didn't reply, when I didn't move, when I didn't finish the sentence he had already written for me, he stepped back with a look that wasn't surprise and wasn't satisfaction. It was just clarity, and I hated how calmly he wore it. That evening, we found ourselves in the kitchen again, this time not by chance, not because of meals or routine, but because everything had narrowed to this. Two people standing in a room that no longer held space for pretending, surrounded by the familiar sounds of a life that looked the same to everyone else and completely different to the two of us. And in that silence, we didn't move, we didn't speak, we didn't even blink, because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't confirm what already lived between us. The morning sun spilled across the kitchen counter in long golden stripes that stretched toward the floor like something sacred, and I stood barefoot at the sink with my sleeves rolled up and a dish towel slung over one shoulder, washing the plates from breakfast while Tom dried them beside me with a calmness that felt too practiced, too easy, like we had done this 100 times before, though we hadn't. And though my husband was only a few yards away, kneeling in the garden outside, pruning the overgrown tomato plants with both gloves on and headphones tucked under his cap, I couldn't hear the music he listened to, but I could picture the sway of his head to the rhythm of something bluesy and familiar, the kind of soundtrack that let him disappear into his own world, while mine was quietly unraveling in plain sight. The air between me and Tom was still, thick not with heat, but with the tension that had been simmering under the surface since that First touch on the staircase, and neither of us spoke as we moved in tandem between sink and towel and cupboard, our motions smooth and automatic, but our eyes met more than once in the glassy reflection of the microwave door, and each time he looked at me, really looked, I felt my pulse tick a little faster under my skin. When I turned to place the last mug on the drying rack, he stepped in closer than before, not brushing against me but narrowing the space with the kind of slow intent that made it impossible to pretend he needed to reach for anything at all. And he stood there silently for a second, with the towel still in his hands, his gaze locked on mine, unflinching, heavy, questioning nothing. And before I could decide whether to move or speak or even take a breath, he leaned forward and kissed me. It wasn't a quick kiss or a stolen glance of a moment. It was longer, deeper, heavier than anything we had allowed before, and I didn't pull away. I didn't even think about pulling away. My hand found his shoulder not out of instinct, but because I needed to balance the rush of everything crashing into me at once. Guilt. Yes, and fear. Yes, but also something undeniable and quiet and terrible in its rightness. And I kissed him back not softly, not out of confusion, but with the weight of someone who already knew what it meant and had stopped pretending she didn't. And then the door opened. The back door creaked the way it always did when pushed from outside, the familiar sound of wood dragging lightly against the tile just before the rubber doorstop clicked into place, and the sound should have pulled us apart. Instantly, should have broken the spell or shocked us back into sense. But we were too slow, or too lost, or too far gone, and by the time I turned my head in panic, my husband was already standing in the doorway. He didn't speak right away. He stood there, one gloved hand still holding a pair of garden shears, the other hanging useless at his side, and his face didn't contort or collapse or scream. He just stared, frozen, taking in what he saw like someone who had walked into the wrong scene of a story he thought he knew by heart. For 1 second, maybe 2, maybe 3, the room didn't breathe. Then he said, "Don't explain." The words were quiet, not whispered, not cracked, just level and certain and flat in the way a door sounds when it closes all the way on the first try. And he turned before I could take a step forward, before I could open my mouth or even fully, reached toward him, and he walked out of the kitchen without waiting to see what I'd do. I ran after him. I dropped the towel on the floor and followed him through the hallway and out the front door. But by the time I made it to the driveway, he was already at the driver's side of the car with the door open and his keys in hand. And when I called his name, not loudly but with enough force to shake something loose inside my own chest, he didn't answer, didn't look back, didn't speak. He just got in and slammed the door hard enough to make the windows tremble, then backed out of the driveway with a speed that didn't match the calm way he'd spoken. And I stood in the middle of the path with one arm still half raised as if I had something to hand him that I hadn't realized I'd lost. The wind kicked up a dry leaf and tossed it across the sidewalk, and I watched it turn twice before vanishing beneath the neighbor's hedge, and then I turned back toward the house, my chest hollow and my mouth dry and my mind already scrambling to make sense of something that couldn't be undone. When I walked back into the kitchen, Tom hadn't moved far. He was still near the counter, still holding the same dish towel like he had never dropped it, and his expression didn't carry regret or relief, only a kind of finality, the cold knowing that what had just happened would mark everything that came next. And he looked at me with the weight of someone who had seen it coming before it arrived. "Now you know for sure," he said, his voice steady, not cruel, not triumphant, just clear, "that it's over." And I nodded once, slow and full, because there was nothing left to say except the word that had already begun echoing between us before I said it. Yes. The light in the kitchen that morning poured in through the wide window with the kind of warmth that made everything look innocent even when it wasn't, and I stood in front of the sink with both hands deep in soapy water, scrubbing the last of the breakfast plates while the air around me remained still and quiet except for the soft background hum of the old radio that played low enough not to draw attention but steady enough to fill the space between my thoughts. And beside me, Tom dried each dish I passed to him with slow, deliberate movements that didn't belong to a guest or a friend or a college boy just passing time, but to someone who had already made up his mind about what he wanted, and now simply waited for the rest of the world to catch up. Outside the kitchen window, just past the herb boxes and the back steps, I could see my husband bent over in the garden, wearing his worn denim shirt and his gardening gloves, carefully pruning the tomato vines that had grown too wild over the summer while his favorite cap shielded his face from the morning sun. And I could tell from the way he moved that he was listening to music through his old wired headphones, the ones he always said worked better than any wireless ones. And in that moment, there was something cruel about how completely unaware he was of what was unfolding just a few feet away on the other side of the glass, something unbearably fragile about the way he hummed along and wiped sweat from his forehead while I stood inside, washing dishes beside someone who had already crossed a boundary I should have never let move. As I turned to place the final plate onto the drying rack, My hand brushed the counter, and I felt a presence behind me that didn't belong to anything accidental or innocent. And when I looked to the side, Tom stepped closer, not with a stumble or a laugh or any kind of excuse, but with that same calm, unblinking stillness that had followed me for weeks. And when he stood close enough for me to feel the warmth radiating from his body, I didn't step back, didn't reach for a towel or move away. I simply looked at him and held that space like it meant nothing, even though we both knew it meant everything. He didn't ask if he could kiss me, and I didn't ask him to stop, because by then there was nothing left to ask and nothing left to deny. And when he leaned forward and pressed his mouth to mine, with the kind of intention that couldn't be mistaken for confusion or mistake, I didn't resist or pull away. I didn't shift or flinch or try to tell myself it was just 1 second too long, because it wasn't 1 second, it was several. And when I kissed him back, it wasn't soft or questioning or conflicted. It was full and real and shameful in a way that only feels possible when you've been walking toward it one step at a time for far too long. The door opened just as I let myself lean deeper into the kiss, and I heard the creak of the frame and the soft tap of the rubber stopper hit the tile in a sound so familiar it registered in my body before my mind caught up. And by the time I turned my head and stepped back, breath shallow and hands trembling slightly, my husband was already standing in the doorway with one glove still on and a pair of garden scissors hanging loosely from his hand. And the look on his face wasn't shock or rage or heartbreak. It was something worse. It was clarity. He stood there for what felt like a full minute, but was probably only a few seconds, long enough for my cheeks to flush and for my throat to close up with the weight of everything I hadn't said. And then he looked straight at me with eyes that didn't blink and lips that didn't tremble, and he said, "Don't explain," in a voice that didn't shake or raise, a voice that sounded like it had already rehearsed this moment in some quiet, buried part of him, and had finally arrived at the words it always knew it would have to say. Without giving me a chance to speak or step forward or reach for him in a last-second effort to rewrite what he had just seen, he turned and walked out of the room with a pace that didn't rush but didn't pause either, and I followed him down the hall and through the front door with a half-whispered plea already forming in my throat. But by the time I reached the steps, he was already unlocking the car and throwing his gloves into the passenger seat with the kind of finality that made my stomach drop before he even closed the door. I said his name once. Not loudly, not dramatically, just loud enough for it to hang in the air between us like a question I didn't know how to finish, and he didn't answer or look back. He just started the engine, backed out of the driveway, and disappeared without leaving anything behind except a hollow that filled the entire house before the dust even settled. When I turned back and re-entered the kitchen, Tom hadn't moved from where he stood at the counter with the dish towel still in his hand, and he looked at me with that same measured stillness he always wore when he knew he had pushed something too far, but wasn't sorry for it. And after a few seconds of silence, he said, "Now you know for sure it's over." And I didn't protest or deflect or try to shift blame. I just looked at the floor and said, "Yes," because there was nothing else to say. The air in the kitchen didn't move after that, not in temperature or sound or feeling, and I stood by the counter with my hands resting on the cool tile, as if grounding myself there could somehow undo what had just unfolded, but nothing shifted. Not the silence, not the certainty, not the fact that everything had just been seen in plain daylight without excuse or delay. And while I tried to gather the breath I hadn't let out since my husband turned away and walked out the front door, Tom remained exactly where he was, no longer touching anything, no longer holding the dish towel, no longer smiling or smirking or studying me like he had for weeks, but simply watching with the calmness of someone who had never once doubted that it would all come to this. Turned away not because I needed to leave the room or because I was ashamed, although I was, but because I didn't know what else to do with myself except move toward the hallway where the sunlight no longer reached. And I thought that maybe, if I walked far enough away from where we had just kissed, I could think clearly again. But I only made it halfway down the hall before I heard the soft buzz of a text message come through on my phone, the sound sharp and bright in the quiet house. And when I pulled it from the side table and looked at the screen, the message staring back at me was from my husband, short and final, with no punctuation, no hesitation, just a single sentence. That landed harder than any confrontation ever could. "I'll come get my things tonight, I don't want to talk." There was no greeting, no demand, no threat. Just distance made visible through words that said everything without needing explanation. And I stood in the center of the hallway holding the phone with both hands like it might fall apart if I let it go. And I read the message 3 more times before I put the phone back on the table face down and walked slowly back toward the kitchen where Tom still stood, now facing the sink with his back to me, as if washing the silence from the room, even though the water hadn't been turned on and nothing in the house was being cleaned. When I stepped inside, he didn't turn to look at me, didn't speak right away, didn't ask about the message or whether my husband had said more. He just let a few seconds pass before he finally said, "So what are you going to do now?" Not like someone offering comfort or concern, but like someone asking whether the next door would be opened or closed completely. I didn't answer right away because I didn't know how to name what came next, because every possibility felt both too dramatic and too hollow. And when I did finally speak, my voice came out quieter than I expected, but clearer than I feared. And I said, "I'm going to be alone." Not because I wanted to be, not because I was trying to punish anyone, but because I knew there was no longer a version of this where I could go back or forward without first sitting inside what I had broken. He didn't answer. He didn't argue or reassure or follow that statement with a plan or a reaction or anything. At all, he just stood still for a moment longer, then nodded slowly as if agreeing with something I hadn't said, and he turned without looking me in the eye and walked toward the hallway with footsteps softer than I expected, each one fading into the distance without pause until I heard the faint click of his door closing down the guest wing of the house. I stayed in the kitchen alone with the sound of the radio still murmuring in the background, a song I couldn't name playing quietly under the sound of my breath returning to something closer to normal. And I looked around at the clean counters and the drying dishes and the open window, letting in fresh air that didn't feel fresh at all anymore. And I realized that no matter how many things I had tried to keep under control, they had all slipped. Anyway, one after another in glances and touches and silences that I told myself I could manage, until one moment made the truth so undeniable that even the people who had trusted me most didn't want to hear my voice. I walked slowly across the kitchen and turned off the faucet that had started to drip, the sound too rhythmic now to bear, and I stood by the back door and looked out into the garden where my husband had been only an hour earlier, his tools still lying scattered across the soil, one glove tossed near the edge of the path, the small wooden crate half filled with pruned stems that no one had bothered to clean up. And I leaned my forehead gently against the glass and stayed there without crying, without moving, without reaching for anything, because there was nothing to reach for, nothing to pull close, nothing to say that would soften what had already torn. There would be no dramatic fight, no shouting in the driveway, no tears begged into someone's shirt, only silence and space and messages sent without voice, and a dinner table that wouldn't be set that night, and footsteps that would never again come down the hallway with the same rhythm they had held before. The hallway felt colder than usual that morning, not because the weather had changed or because the windows had been left open, but because the air itself carried a different kind of weight, a kind that made each footstep sound louder, more final. And as I stood just inside the doorway of the guest room watching Tom move around with mechanical precision, lifting shirts from drawers and folding them too carefully into a suitcase that had sat unused since the day he arrived, I knew without asking that he had made his decision long before I had the courage to face mine, and he didn't speak, didn't ask for help, didn't offer an explanation or even a glance in my direction. He just zipped the suitcase slowly, grabbed the charger from the floor by the nightstand, and walked past me without a nod or a pause or the smallest acknowledgement of everything we had shared, disappearing through the front door as easily as if he had never been here at all. I didn't follow him down the driveway or watch the car pull away. I just stood in the now empty guest room surrounded by the faint scent of laundry detergent and cologne and something else I couldn't quite name. Something that would probably take days to fade from the linens and weeks to leave the walls. And I felt the silence settle around me again. Thicker now. Heavier in a way that didn't feel like absence, but like something unfinished and suspended, mid-breath, and when I went back to the kitchen, my phone vibrated against the counter with the dull rhythm of inevitability. The notification on the screen showed my husband's name, but the message wasn't a message. It was a PDF file with no subject, no text, no greeting, just an attachment that opened into clean, cold legal language outlining property terms and signatures and dates, and every line on that page felt like a door shutting softly but permanently. And as I scrolled through the document with my thumb, there was no emotion, no outburst, no personal note or accusation, just facts arranged into a structure that ended a marriage with surgical clarity. I didn't reply, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because the kind of silence he had chosen didn't leave space for words. And I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen, until it dimmed and locked itself again. And I placed the phone face down on the table and let the stillness of the house wrap tighter around me, knowing now that there would be no return, no last talk, no final confrontation to make sense of the unraveling. 1 week later, the sound of tires on gravel outside the front steps startled me in a way that no sound should in your own home, and I opened the front door to find my daughter standing there with her bag over one shoulder and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. And before I could open my arms or say her name, she pushed past me with a kind of energy that only comes from confusion mixed with betrayal, and as she dropped her bag by the couch and scanned the room like it might explain something, I knew she already knew. She didn't ask gently, she didn't build up to it. She just looked at me and said his name, then followed it with mine, and said the word I had been dreading, how. And when I didn't answer fast enough, or right enough, or clearly enough, her voice rose until the windows seemed to vibrate, and the plants by the window shook. And she said things I had already told myself 100 times, but hearing them out loud from her was a different kind of punishment. She left the same evening, before dinner, before the sunset, before the apology I hadn't found the words for could be spoken. And I watched her throw her bag into the back seat of the same car that used to take her to high school. And when she pulled out of the driveway, she didn't look back. And I stood behind the curtain with my hand on the window frame, knowing that I had not only lost a marriage, but something deeper that might never return to me. In the days that followed, the neighborhood changed in ways so small they would have gone unnoticed if I hadn't been paying such close attention, like how the neighbor from across the street no longer waved when he got the mail and instead crossed the street without looking toward my porch, and how another woman I barely knew stopped walking her dog past my house and changed her route entirely. And one afternoon when I was pulling weeds from the flower bed near the fence, a man from 2 doors down walked past and nodded once before saying, "So, I guess you're selling soon?" And when I said no, with as much steadiness as I could, he just gave a half shrug and kept walking like he hadn't heard me at all. One evening, after another day without messages and without visitors, I received a text from a number I hadn't spoken to in months, and it was from an old friend I hadn't seen since the winter before everything changed, and the message said only, "Is it true you slept with your daughter's friend?" And I stared at those words for a full minute before typing back the only answer I could think of: no, even though I knew it didn't matter anymore, because the version of the truth people believed was the only one they would keep, and no explanation I gave now would clean the stain that had already been named. The next morning, I tried to call my husband one last time, not to beg or explain or ask for understanding, but just to hear the line ring one more time before I let it go, and the call didn't go through, not because the phone was off or disconnected, but because my number had been blocked, and when I checked my messages, I saw that my contact photo had disappeared from every chat, and there was no trace of him left in any app, any thread, any place where we had once exchanged the details of everyday life. I didn't go back into the garden after that. I stopped going outside not because of fear or shame or guilt that still hadn't let go of my spine, but because the air beyond the front door didn't belong to me anymore, and the moment I stepped onto the porch or even leaned near the kitchen window, I could feel eyes that weren't mine watching from the edges, subtle shifts of blinds and too long glances from driveways where conversations used to feel casual, and the walk to the grocery store became the only journey I allowed myself to make, always with sunglasses, always with the same canvas tote, always with my head slightly down like I was still pretending I had nothing to explain. And I took the long route through the side streets even though it added time, because the longer I stayed in motion, the less I had to think about how still everything had become at home. Inside the house, the days lost their shape, blurring between the sound of the refrigerator kicking on and the click of light switches that no longer felt connected to a living space, and I stopped setting the table for dinner, stopped checking the front gate, stopped watering the plants in the dining room, even though I saw them start to wilt at the edges like they were following the rhythm of my silence, and I left Tom's empty guest room untouched, not out of sentiment or hope, but because the sound of the zipper on the mattress protector would have been louder than anything I was ready to hear again. I didn't turn on the television for almost a week because every show felt scripted in a way my life no longer was, and every couple on screen looked like strangers pretending they hadn't betrayed each other, and even the laughter tracks felt cruel, like reminders of a time when rooms held voices that wanted to stay, and the only sound I let echo through the house was the quiet clink of dishes when I rinsed a cup, or the soft shuffle of my own footsteps between the kitchen and the hall. Always back to the same 3 rooms, always looping like nothing outside that orbit was safe to touch anymore. When I passed the living room mirror, I sometimes stopped, not to examine my face, but to count the ways it no longer belonged to the version of me I used to recognize. And I would stand there for minutes without moving, just staring at the faint crease above my brow and the way my shoulders rounded slightly forward, not from pain or fatigue, but from the weight of holding in everything I had chosen not to say aloud, and I realized that silence doesn't protect you. It just rearranges your shape until you no longer fit anywhere. By the time the weekend came again, the mail was still being delivered, but I had stopped opening most of it, especially anything with clean white envelopes or printed addresses, because I already knew there was nothing left inside those pages that could change what had been done. And the last time I checked my phone, I saw that even the group messages from old family chats had gone quiet, either muted or archived or deleted by people who no longer wanted to scroll past my name, and the absence didn't sting anymore. It just sat there like dust on a photo frame that no one bothers to clean because it no longer draws attention. Sunday afternoon, I finally let myself sit at the kitchen table again, the one that used to hold long breakfasts and grocery lists and arguments about weekend chores. And I pulled out the same chair I always used to sit in, the one that faced the window and had a small scratch on the left leg from when we moved it during the last flooring renovation. And I set down a cup of tea I didn't want but couldn't stop making, and I looked at the chair across from mine, the one my husband always used, the one Tom had taken a few times when he still pretended not to sit too close. And I let my eyes rest there without blinking for what felt like hours. There was nothing in that chair now, no jacket draped over the back, no folded newspaper left behind, no ring of moisture from a glass forgotten on a coaster, just emptiness and the slight echo of memory that didn't soften the stillness but sharpened it. And I realized that the worst part of what had happened wasn't the loss or the silence or the names I had been called. It was that the room had become too quiet to carry anyone else's presence, too hollow to invite even forgiveness back in, too still to be anything but mine now. I didn't cry when I sat there. I didn't whisper apologies into the empty space or write letters I wouldn't send or imagine anyone walking through the door again. I just sat with the sound of the ticking wall clock and the low hum of the refrigerator and the weight of knowing that the house no longer waited for anyone. It simply held what was left of me.